Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the exploration ship Endeavour and looked at the strange signals coming from deep space. The readings showed something he had never seen before. Large ships moved in perfect formation around a blue planet covered in crystal cities. The energy patterns were unlike anything in human databases. Jake had been exploring space for 15 years. He had met many alien species during his travels. Some were friendly and some were not. But these new aliens seemed different. Their technology was far beyond human understanding. Their ships glowed with soft light and moved without any visible engines. The planet below sparkled like a giant gem. Cities stretched across entire continents in perfect geometric patterns. Nothing seemed damaged or old. Everything looked new and clean. Jake wondered how long these beings had lived there. Commander Lisa Parker walked up to Jake's side. She was the best diplomat in the human fleet. Her job was to make peaceful contact with new alien species. She had done this 12 times before without any major problems. Lisa looked at the readings and frowned. The alien ships had noticed the human vessel. They began sending signals in mathematical patterns. The computer translated the basic numbers easily enough. The aliens called themselves Zephyrians. They seemed curious about the humans, but also very careful. Lisa opened communication channels. The first messages were simple. Basic math and science. Concepts. The Zephyrians responded quickly. Their translation systems were very good. Soon both sides were exchanging information about their civilizations. The Zephyrians asked about human biology. This was normal for first contact. Most aliens wanted to know what humans looked like and how they lived. Lisa sent the standard data package. It included information about human anatomy, lifespan, and basic needs. Everything changed when the Zephyrians received the human lifespan data. The alien signals suddenly stopped. All their ships began moving away from the Endeavour at high speed. Emergency broadcasts filled the communication channels. The word Deathwalkers appeared over and over in the translations. Lisa tried to contact them again. She sent peaceful messages and offered to meet on neutral ground. The Zephyrians responded with what could only be described as panic. They warned all ships in the area to stay away from the humans. They called humans the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Jake could not understand what had gone wrong. Humans were not the strongest or smartest species they had met. They did not have the best weapons or fastest ships. What made them so frightening to these advanced aliens? Dr. Kevin Walsh joined them on the bridge. He was the mission's expert on alien biology and psychology. Kevin had studied the Zephyrian responses for several hours. His findings were strange and disturbing. Kevin explained that the Zephyrians seemed to have achieved immortality. Their crystal-like bodies did not age or decay. They could live forever if nothing killed them. But this gift came with a terrible cost. They had developed an extreme fear of death. Even thinking about death caused them severe mental distress. Theo. Data showed that Zephyrian civilization was over 10,000 years old. Their oldest citizens remembered the early days when death was still part of their lives. But something had happened long ago that made them remove death from their existence completely. Lisa realized the problem. Humans lived for only about 80 years on average. To immortal beings, this must seem like a brief and terrible existence. The Zephyrians probably thought humans were suffering from some horrible disease that killed them quickly. More disturbing was their reaction to human acceptance of death. Most human cultures had learned to live with mortality. People planned for the future even knowing they would not live forever. They found meaning in their short lives. They were not afraid of death the way the Zephyrians were. This acceptance terrified the Zephyrians more than anything else. How could any intelligent species willingly live with death? How could they function knowing that their existence would end? It went against everything the Zephyrians believed about life and survival. The human crew watched as the entire Zephyrian fleet continued to retreat. They broadcast warnings to other alien civilizations about the dangerous Deathwalkers. They described humans as beings so twisted by mortality that they had embraced death itself. Jake ordered his ship to maintain a safe distance. He did not want to cause a war over a misunderstanding, but he also knew that this first contact had failed completely. The most advanced civilization they had ever met was running away in terror. Dr. Walsh suggested they needed time to study Zephyrian psychology before trying contact again. These beings had lived without death for so long that they could not understand how mortals thought. The concept of limited lifespan was completely foreign to them. Lisa agreed that they needed a new approach. Simply explaining human mortality would not work. The Zephyrians needed to see that death was not a disease or curse. They needed to understand that mortality could give life meaning rather than destroy it. As the Endeavor turned away from Zephyrian space, Jake wondered if these two very different species could ever find common ground. The immortals who feared death and the mortals who accepted it seemed like opposite forces that could never meet peacefully. Admiral Ryan Clark received the emergency message from Captain Morrison 3 days later. The report was unlike anything in human diplomatic history. An entire alien civilization had declared humans too dangerous to approach. They called humans death walkers and warned other species to avoid contact. Ryan read the full report twice before he understood the scope of the problem. The Zephyrians possessed technology that could help humanity explore distant galaxies. Their ships could travel faster than anything humans had built. Their cities had stood for thousands of years without decay. But they refused all contact because humans were mortal. Dr. Kevin Walsh worked around the clock studying Zephyrian broadcasts. The aliens were sharing information about humans with every species they could contact. They described human mortality as a terrible plague that made humans unpredictable and dangerous. They could not understand how beings facing death could remain calm and rational. The broadcasts revealed disturbing details about Zephyrian society. They had not invented anything new in over 4,000 years. Their trade routes had remained the same for millennia. Their art and literature had stopped evolving long ago. They had achieved perfect immortality, but had lost the ability to grow and change. Captain Morrison requested permission to attempt contact again. He believed the misunderstanding could be resolved with better communication, but Admiral Clark worried that pushing too hard might create the first interstellar incident caused by philosophical differences about mortality. Lieutenant Amy Carter joined the research team to study Zephyrian psychology. She had experience helping humans deal with extreme phobias. The Zephyrian fear of death seemed similar to severe anxiety disorders she had treated before. But this fear affected an entire species rather than individual patients. Amy discovered that Zephyrians experience something called death shock when exposed to mortality concepts. Their immortal minds could not process the idea of existence, ending. Even indirect references to death caused complete mental shutdown. 3 Zephyrian diplomats had collapsed just from hearing Captain Morrison mention his grandfather's passing. The research team learned more about Zephyrian history through intercepted communications. 8,000 years ago, their planet had suffered a massive plague. Billions of Zephyrians died before their scientists found a cure. The survivors used advanced biotechnology to remove aging and death from their biology. They succeeded completely, but the trauma of the plague had left deep psychological scars. Engineer Tony Rodriguez made an important observation while studying Zephyrian technology. Their ships and cities were incredibly advanced, but had not changed in thousands of years. They maintained and repaired existing technology, but never developed anything new. Their fear of risk had made innovation impossible. Tony pointed out that human progress came from taking chances. Every major breakthrough in human history had involved some risk of failure or loss. Immortal beings who feared any possibility of death could never take such risks. They had become prisoners of their own safety. Dr. Walsh proposed a theory that shocked the research team. The Zephyrians had not just removed death from their biology, they had removed the psychological drive that made life meaningful. Without the knowledge that time was limited, they had no urgency to accomplish anything. Without the possibility of loss, nothing had value. Amy realized that humans and Zephyrians represented opposite solutions to the problem of mortality. Humans had accepted death and found meaning in limited time. Zephyrians had rejected death and lost the ability to find meaning in unlimited time. Both species were intelligent but had developed completely different relationships with existence. The breakthrough came when the research team studied Zephyrian children. Young Zephyrians born after the Great Plague showed different behavior, patterns than their elders. They had never experienced the trauma of widespread death. They were more curious and willing to take small risks, but they were also taught from birth to fear anything connected to mortality. Captain Morrison suggested a radical plan. If one human could live among the Zephyrians for an extended period, it might prove that mortals were not dangerous, death-obsessed monsters. The human could demonstrate that acceptance of mortality led to meaningful rather than destructive behavior. Admiral Clark was hesitant to risk human lives on such an uncertain mission. The Zephyrians might refuse to allow any human near their population. Even if they agreed, exposure to human mortality concepts might cause widespread panic among their people. But Dr. Walsh argued that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. Contact with Zephyrian technology could advance human civilization by centuries. More importantly, both species might learn something valuable from each other. Humans could show Zephyrians how to live meaningfully. Zephyrians could show humans the benefits of extended lifespans. The Zephyrian Council eventually agreed to a limited exchange program. They would allow 2 humans to live in an isolated research facility on their homeworld. The humans would be studied like dangerous specimens, but they would have the chance to prove that mortality was not a curse. Sergeant Ben Carter volunteered for the mission despite the obvious dangers. He was a practical man who understood machinery and had experience working in hostile environments. He was not afraid of death and could demonstrate calm human behavior under stress. Dr. Rachel Price also volunteered to join the mission. She was a philosopher who specialized in questions about the meaning of life and death. She could explain human attitudes toward mortality in ways that might help the Zephyrians understand. As the 2 humans prepared for their journey to the Zephyrian homeworld, the research team continued studying alien broadcasts. The Zephyrians were deeply divided about the exchange program. Younger Zephyrians were curious about these strange mortals who embraced death. Older Zephyrians worried that exposure to human ideas might contaminate their perfect immortal society. The stage was set for the most unusual cultural exchange in galactic history. 2 mortals would live among immortals to prove that death was not humanity's weakness, but possibly its greatest strength. Sergeant Ben Carter stepped off the transport shuttle onto the crystal surface of the Zephyrian research facility. The building looked like it had been grown rather than built. Smooth walls curved upward without visible joints or seams. Everything gleamed with the same eternal perfection he had seen in the orbital images of Zephyrian cities. Dr. Rachel Price followed behind him, carrying their limited personal belongings. The Zephyrians had insisted that humans bring no technology that might contaminate their sterile environment. Ben and Rachel would live like prisoners for the next 6 months, while alien scientists studied their every move. Chief Researcher Jacques greeted them at the entrance. The Zephyrian looked like a walking crystal sculpture with internal light that pulsed slowly. Jacques spoke through a translation device that made its voice sound hollow and distant. The researcher explained that humans would be observed at all times for the safety of Zephyrian civilization. The living quarters were comfortable but clearly designed for containment rather than hospitality. Walls were transparent on one side so Zephyrian observers could watch without being seen. Cameras recorded everything from multiple angles. Ben felt like an animal in a zoo, but he understood the necessity of such precautions. Dr. Price began her work immediately by explaining basic human philosophy to the research team. She described how humans had learned to find meaning in limited lifespans. People created art and literature that would outlast their individual deaths. They had children to continue their genetic and cultural legacy. They formed emotional bonds, despite knowing that all relationships would eventually end. The Zephyrian researchers found these concepts disturbing and incomprehensible. How could intelligent beings willingly create anything knowing they would not live to see its completion? How could they love knowing that love would inevitably end in loss? From the immortal perspective, such behavior seemed like deliberate self-torture. Ben demonstrated human practical skills by maintaining the research facility's equipment. The building was thousands of years old, but had been perfectly preserved by Zephyrian technology. Nothing ever broke down or wore out. Ben noticed that the maintenance systems were incredibly sophisticated, but had not been updated in centuries. The first major incident occurred during Ben's third week at the facility. While repairing a ventilation system, he cut his hand on a sharp piece of metal. The injury was minor by human standards, but it caused immediate panic among the Zephyrian observers. They had never seen blood or witnessed physical damage to a living being. Ben calmly cleaned and bandaged the wound while Zephyrian researchers watched in amazement. He showed no signs of the death shock that would have overwhelmed any immortal being. He did not panic or become irrational from exposure to his own mortality. He simply treated the injury and continued working. Dr. Price used the incident to explain human attitudes toward physical vulnerability. She described how humans had learned to accept that their bodies could be damaged and that such damage was part of normal existence. Pain and injury reminded humans of their mortality, but did not paralyze them with fear. Jacques became fascinated by human emotional responses to mortality-related concepts. Humans grieved when loved ones died, but they did not experience complete mental breakdown. They planned for futures they might not live to see without becoming consumed by anxiety about their limited time. They took calculated risks, despite knowing that mistakes could be fatal. The breakthrough came when Ben volunteered to repair a reactor that had been malfunctioning for 50 years. The reactor was not dangerous by human standards, but it posed a theoretical risk of injury or death. No Zephyrian had been willing to attempt repairs because any possibility of harm was unacceptable to immortal minds. Ben studied the reactor schematics for 2 days before beginning work. The problem was simple by human engineering standards. A cooling system had become clogged with mineral deposits. The repair required someone to enter a cramped space and clear the blockage manually. The work was uncomfortable and mildly risky, but well within normal human safety limits. The Zephyrian research team watched in stunned silence as Ben crawled into the reactor housing. They could not understand how any intelligent being would voluntarily enter a situation with even minimal risk of harm. From their perspective, Ben was demonstrating either incredible courage or complete insanity. Ben completed the repairs in 3 hours. The reactor began functioning normally for the first time in 5 decades. The Zephyrians had possessed the knowledge and tools to fix the problem, but had been paralyzed by their fear of any possible danger. A mortal human had accomplished what immortals could not, because he was not afraid of acceptable risks. Dr. Price explained that human willingness to take calculated risks came from understanding that avoiding all danger was impossible. Humans had learned that trying to eliminate every risk led to a life so constrained that it was not worth living. Better to accept reasonable dangers and live fully than to exist safely but meaninglessly. The concept began to spread beyond the research facility through Zephyrian communication networks. Young Zephyrians who had never experienced the trauma of the Great Plague became curious about human attitudes toward mortality and risk. They began asking questions that their elders could not answer. If immortality was the highest achievement of Zephyrian civilization, why had their culture stopped growing and changing? If avoiding death was so important, why did perfectly safe immortal existence feel empty and meaningless? If humans were suffering from the curse of mortality, why did they seem more alive than immortal Zephyrians? Engineer Nathan Brooks arrived to assist with the exchange program during the 4th month. He brought additional human perspectives on mortality and meaning. Nathan was a young man who approached problems with enthusiasm despite knowing his life would be brief by Zephyrian standards. Nathan's arrival allowed the research team to observe human social interactions. The two engineers worked together effectively despite their limited time together. They shared knowledge and helped each other solve problems without the careful calculations that governed all Zephyrian relationships. Dr. Price noted that human cooperation was enhanced rather than hindered by mortality. Knowing that time was limited made humans more willing to trust and assist each other quickly. Immortal beings had endless time to evaluate every relationship and consequently formed fewer meaningful connections. As the 6-month exchange period neared its end, the Zephyrian research team faced an unprecedented situation. Everything they had learned about humans contradicted their fundamental beliefs about mortality and immortality. The Deathwalkers were not dangerous monsters, but beings who had found wisdom in accepting the very thing Zephyrians feared most. The news from the research facility spread through Zephyrian society like wildfire. Reports described humans who worked calmly despite being injured. Mortals who repaired dangerous equipment without fear. Beings who found meaning in temporary existence rather than despair in approaching death. Young Zephyrians began to question everything they had been taught about mortality and immortality. Artist Zixal was among the first Zephyrians to be affected by human concepts. For 3,000 years, Zixal had created the same types of crystal sculptures that Zephyrian artists had been making since ancient times. The forms were perfect and would last forever like everything else in immortal society. But after learning about human attitudes toward temporary existence, Zixal began to wonder why permanence was so important. Zixal created something that shocked Zephyrian civilization, a sculpture made from ice that would melt within days. The artwork was beautiful, but deliberately temporary. It represented the idea that something could be valuable precisely because it would not last forever. The concept was so revolutionary that it caused riots in the capital city of Ethernal. Traditional Zephyrians were horrified by the ice sculpture. They saw it as evidence that human ideas were contaminating their perfect society. How could any rational being create something designed to disappear? The sculpture represented everything they had spent 10,000 years trying to avoid: impermanence, change, and ultimately death. But younger Zephyrians responded differently to Zixal's artwork. They found beauty in the idea that something precious could be temporary. They began to understand that unlimited time might actually make individual moments less valuable rather than more valuable. If every moment lasted forever, then no moment was special. Captain Julie Foster arrived with a new diplomatic team as the controversy spread throughout Zephyrian space. Her mission was to establish formal relations between humans and Zephyrians, but she found a civilization in the middle of a cultural crisis. Half the population wanted to learn more about human mortality concepts, while the other half demanded that all humans be banned from their territory. Dr. Michael Chen joined the diplomatic team as a specialist in cultural psychology. He documented how human ideas were affecting different segments of Zephyrian society. Older Zephyrians who remembered the Great Plague remained terrified of anything connected to death. But younger Zephyrians who had been born into immortality were curious about concepts their elders could not explain. The generational divide created unprecedented tension in Zephyrian society. For millennia, their culture had been stable because everyone shared the same fundamental beliefs about immortality and safety. Now, young Zephyrians were questioning whether their ancestors had chosen the right path when they eliminated death from their existence. Researcher Kyle Eth became the most famous example of what traditionalists called mortality infection. After Studying human psychology reports for months, Kyleth announced her intention to voluntarily limit her lifespan to 1,000 years. She wanted to experience what humans called urgency and meaning that came from knowing time was limited. The announcement caused the greatest political crisis in Zephyrian history. Elder Morvex and the traditionalist faction demanded that Kyleth be forcibly prevented from harming herself through voluntary mortality. They argued that allowing any Zephyrian to choose death would destroy their perfect society and undo 10,000 years of progress. But Kyleth had supporters among young Zephyrians who called themselves the Finite Movement. They argued that true freedom required the right to choose one's relationship with mortality. If immortality was truly better than limited lifespan, then Zephyrians should be able to choose it freely rather than having it forced upon them. Commander Alex Thompson documented the most significant development in the crisis. Young Zephyrians were beginning to form relationships based on emotional choice rather than eternal convenience. Traditional Zephyrian partnerships lasted forever because divorce was impossible for immortal beings. But finite Zephyrians wanted relationships that meant something beyond mere permanence. The conservative faction led by Elder Morvex demanded emergency measures to contain the spreading influence of human mortality concepts. They proposed quarantining all Zephyrians who had been exposed to human ideas. They wanted to ban all communication with humans and destroy any records of the cultural exchange program. But the Finite Movement refused to cooperate with quarantine measures. For the first time in millennia, a significant portion of Zephyrian society actively resisted their government's authority. They held public meetings to discuss human philosophy. They created temporary art that celebrated impermanence. They formed voluntary associations based on choice rather than obligation. Dr. Chen realized that Zephyrian society was experiencing something unprecedented in their history: internal conflict. For 10,000 years, their culture had been unified by shared fear of death and commitment to eternal safety. Now they were divided by fundamentally different beliefs about the value and meaning of existence. The crisis deepened when several hundred young Zephyrians announced their intention to leave immortal society entirely. They wanted to establish new communities based on human principles of finite existence and meaningful time. They proposed shortening their lifespans to experience what humans called purpose and urgency. Traditional Zephyrians viewed this proposal as mass suicide. How could intelligent beings voluntarily choose to die when they could live forever? The idea violated every principle their civilization had been built upon. It represented the ultimate victory of human infection over Zephyrian wisdom. Captain Foster attempted to mediate between the two factions, but found the philosophical divide too deep for simple compromise. Traditionalists and the Finite Movement were not arguing about policy details, but about the fundamental nature of meaningful existence. No diplomatic solution could resolve such basic disagreements about the purpose of life. The situation became more complex when some traditional Zephyrians began privately admitting doubts about their immortal society. Elder Vex High confided to human diplomats that he sometimes felt as though he had stopped truly living 8,000 years ago. He had achieved everything possible in unlimited time, but felt empty rather than fulfilled. Young Zephyrians seized on such admissions as proof that immortality had failed to provide the happiness and meaning it promised. They argued that their ancestors had chosen safety over growth, permanence over purpose, existence over life. They wanted the chance to make different choices, even if those choices involved accepting mortality. As the cultural crisis intensified, both humans and Zephyrians realized they were witnessing something historic. Two completely different approaches to existence were meeting for the first time. The outcome would determine whether immortal and mortal civilizations could coexist, or whether their fundamental differences made peaceful contact impossible. The first Zephyrian civil war in 8,000 years began not with weapons but with ideas. The finite movement, led by artist Zixal and researcher Kileth, demanded the legal right to choose mortality if they wished. Traditional Zephyrians, led by Elder Morvex, declared that allowing voluntary death would destroy their civilization and betray the millions who had died in the Great Plague. Colonel Daniel Murphy arrived with peacekeeping forces, expecting to find military conflict between the two factions. Instead, he discovered something far more complex. Zephyrians were fighting over philosophical concepts rather than territory or resources. They were divided by different beliefs about the meaning of existence, rather than political disagreements. Daniel quickly realized that human military intervention would only make the crisis worse. Traditional Zephyrians already viewed humans as dangerous carriers of mortality infection. Any show of force would prove their claims that mortals were violent and destructive. Instead, Daniel proposed something unprecedented in galactic diplomacy: a formal debate between the two factions to resolve their differences through discussion rather than conflict. The Great Discourse lasted 47 days and was broadcast throughout Zephyrian space. Elder Vexhai and the traditionalists argued that immortality represented the highest achievement of their civilization. They had conquered humanity's greatest enemy and created a perfect society free from death and suffering. Accepting mortality would undo 10 millennia of progress and dishonor those who had died in the plague. Zixal and the finite movement countered that Zephyrian society had not progressed at all since achieving immortality. They had simply stopped changing and growing. Their art had become repetitive. Their science had stagnated. Their relationships had lost meaning because nothing was ever at risk. They existed, but they did not truly live. Dr. Angela Wells provided crucial testimony as a human expert on historical civilizations. She explained how human societies had risen and fallen throughout history, but each generation had built upon the achievements of previous ones. Knowledge accumulated across centuries as mortal humans worked to accomplish great things in their limited lifespans. Angela described how human art and literature had evolved constantly because each generation of artists brought new perspectives, shaped by their awareness of mortality. Scientists took risks to make discoveries because they knew their time was limited. Leaders made difficult decisions because they understood the consequences of inaction. The testimony that shocked Zephyrian society most came from their own Elder Morvex. During the 32nd day of the debate, he asked a question that stunned traditionalists and vindicated the finite movement. If immortal society was so perfect, why did he feel as though he had stopped truly living 8,000 years ago? Morvex described the emptiness that had grown within him over millennia of perfect safety. He had achieved everything possible in unlimited time, but felt no satisfaction in his accomplishments. He had formed relationships that lasted forever, but they had become routine rather than meaningful. He existed in perfection, but felt dead inside. The admission created chaos in traditionalist ranks. If their most respected elder questioned the value of immortality, then perhaps the finite movement was correct about the problems with their society. Young Zephyrians saw Morvex's confession as proof that unlimited existence without purpose was worse than limited existence with meaning. Pilot Sarah Jackson provided the most dramatic demonstration of human courage during the debate. She volunteered to fly through an unstable wormhole that promised to lead to previously unknown galaxies. The mission had a significant chance of failure and death, but offered the possibility of major discoveries. No Zephyrian would attempt such a mission because any risk of death was unacceptable to immortal minds. But Sarah approached the dangerous flight as a calculated risk worth taking for the advancement of knowledge. Her successful return with data about new star systems and alien civilizations forced Zephyrians to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their fear of death had made them prisoners of their own safety. While humans explored dangerous regions of space and made incredible discoveries, Zephyrians had remained in their familiar territory for thousands of years. They had achieved immortality, but lost the courage needed for growth and exploration. The debate revealed fundamental differences between mortal and immortal psychology. Humans took risks because they understood that avoiding all danger led to meaningless existence. Zephyrians avoided risks because any possibility of death triggered overwhelming fear. The result was that mortals accomplished more in brief lifespans than immortals achieved in unlimited time. Kyleth presented the final argument for the finite movement with devastating effectiveness. She challenged traditionalists to explain why their immortal society had produced no new art, literature, science, or philosophy in 4,000 years. If unlimited time was such an advantage, why had they stopped creating and discovering? The traditionalists could not answer because the truth was too painful to admit. They had achieved perfect safety, but lost the motivation that came from urgency and risk. They had eliminated death, but also eliminated the meaning that mortality provided. They existed forever, but had nothing important to do with eternity. The vote was closer than anyone expected, but the result changed Zephyrian civilization forever. By a narrow margin, they chose to allow individuals the right to embrace mortality if they wished while maintaining immortality for those who preferred eternal existence. The decision split their society, but avoided civil war. Elder HFY announced his own intention to explore limited lifespan as an experiment in rediscovering meaning. His decision inspired thousands of other Zephyrians to consider voluntary mortality. They wanted to experience what humans called purpose and urgency that came from knowing time was precious. Not all Zephyrians accepted the decision peacefully. Some traditionalists retreated to isolated colonies where they could maintain pure immortal society without contamination from mortality concepts. They viewed the majority decision as temporary insanity that would eventually be reversed. But the finite movement gained momentum as more Zephyrians experienced the liberation that came from choosing their relationship with death. They formed new communities dedicated to meaningful existence rather than eternal safety. They began creating art and literature that celebrated temporary beauty rather than permanent perfection. Colonel Murphy realized that humans had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. An immortal civilization had voluntarily chosen to embrace mortality not as punishment, but as a path to greater meaning and purpose. The decision would reshape both species and change the future of interstellar civilization. 5 years after first contact between humans and Zephyrians, the galaxy had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The immortal civilization that once feared death above all else had transformed into a vibrant society where both mortals and immortals worked together toward common goals. The border world of New Haven became the symbol of this unprecedented cooperation. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the joint colony watching humans and Zephyrians construct the first interstellar city designed by both species. Mortal humans worked alongside Zephyrians who had chosen finite lifespans, while immortal Zephyrians provided continuity and long-term planning. The combination created something neither species could have achieved alone. The colony's architecture reflected the merger of two very different philosophies about existence. Human buildings were designed for efficiency and function, with the understanding that they might need to be replaced or modified as needs changed. Zephyrian structures were built to last for millennia, but now incorporated features that could be updated by future generations. Elder HFY had become one of the most surprising advocates for the new mixed society. After choosing to limit his lifespan to 500 years, he discovered energy and purpose he had not felt in thousands of years. His shortened time made every day valuable rather than just another endless cycle in eternal existence. HFY often spoke to visitors about the transformation of Zephyrian culture. He explained that his people had thought they defeated death when they achieved immortality, but death had actually defeated them. They had existed without living, survived without thriving, maintained without growing. Humans had taught them that mortality was not a curse, but a gift that gave meaning to existence. Dr. Lisa Park established the Joint Cultural Research Center, where the most important discoveries were being made. Scientists from both species worked together to understand how different relationships with mortality affected psychology, creativity, and social development. The research was already producing insights that benefited both civilizations. The most remarkable changes appeared in Zephyrian children born to mortal parents. These young beings displayed creativity and curiosity that had been absent from their species for millennia. They approached problems with determination similar to humans because they understood that mistakes were opportunities to learn rather than disasters to avoid. Artist Zixal had become famous throughout the galaxy for sculptures that combined human concepts of temporary beauty with Zephyrian technical skill. The artworks were designed to change over time through natural processes. They celebrated impermanence while demonstrating the value of experiencing beauty even when it could not last forever. The collaboration produced technological breakthroughs that neither species could have achieved separately. Engineer Carlos Rodriguez worked with Zixal to design spacecraft capable of reaching distant galaxies. The ships required dangerous technologies that immortal Zephyrians would never have risked developing, but which mortal Zephyrians and humans were willing to attempt. The first intergalactic expedition ship was named Eternity in honor of both species' contributions to its creation. The vessel combined Zephyrian engineering excellence with human willingness to take calculated risks. It was crewed by beings who understood that the journey itself might be more important than arriving safely at the destination. Commander Lisa Parker served as diplomatic liaison between the three types of beings now living in Zephyrian space. Immortal Zephyrians provided wisdom and continuity. Mortal Zephyrians brought urgency and innovation. Humans contributed experience with balancing mortality and meaning. Each group had something valuable to offer the others. The transformation was not without problems. Some traditional Zephyrians remained convinced that their society had made a terrible mistake by allowing voluntary mortality. They retreated to isolated worlds where they maintained pure immortal culture without contamination from finite concepts. They predicted that the experiment would end in disaster, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Mortal Zephyrian communities were producing more art, literature, and scientific discoveries in 5 years than immortal society had created in 4,000 years. They had rediscovered the motivation that came from knowing time was precious and limited. Dr. Kevin Walsh documented the most significant psychological changes in Zephyrian society. Beings who had lived in constant fear of death for millennia were learning to find peace with mortality. They discovered that accepting endings made beginnings more meaningful and that embracing change allowed for growth impossible in static perfection. The joint colonies became centers of innovation that attracted beings from throughout the galaxy. Species that had stagnated in their own perfect societies came to learn how mortality and immortality could complement each other. The Zephyrian experiment proved that different approaches to existence could coexist beneficially. Children born in the mixed communities developed unique perspectives that combined the best aspects of both mortal and immortal psychology. They inherited immortal capabilities for long-term thinking while maintaining mortal appreciation for immediate experience. They represented the future of interstellar civilization. As the expedition ship Eternity prepared for departure to explore unknown galaxies, Captain Morrison reflected on the changes he had witnessed. Humanity had not conquered the Zephyrians through superior technology or military force, but by sharing something far more powerful, the wisdom of how to live meaningfully. Regardless of how much time was available, the ship's crew included representatives of all three groups. Immortal Zephyrians who had overcome their fear of risk. Mortal Zephyrians who had chosen finite existence for greater meaning. Humans who had always understood that death gave life value. Together they would explore regions of space that no single species would have dared to attempt. Engineer Nathan Brooks made the final systems check before departure. The ship represented everything both species had learned from each other. It was built to last for millennia, like Zephyrian technology, but designed for missions that required human-style risk-taking. It embodied the principle that safety and courage could work together rather than oppose each other. As eternity departed from New Haven, it carried with it the greatest discovery of the age. The secret was not how to live forever or how to accept death, but how to find meaning in whatever time was available. Immortals and mortals had different relationships with existence, but both could live with purpose if they chose to do so. The final message transmitted from the departing ship became famous throughout known space. Today, we learned that the greatest gift one species can give another is not the secret of how to live forever, but the wisdom of how to live meaningfully in whatever time we have. The universe was vast enough for both those who chose eternity and those who embraced endings.